Hi, Mark. It's an honour to welcome you today to my podcast, The Human Side of Emergency Management. I just want to explain a little bit to people around the world, a bit about your background. So you're a leader whose work has shaped emergency management in Australia for more than 3 decades. I'd say it's probably more than 4 decades now. You're someone whose leadership has influenced my own journey in profound and lasting ways. Mark, you began your career as a firefighter in 1985, eventually rising to the rank of Commissioner in 2009 with the Emergency Services Agency. You later became the Director General of Emergency Management Australia, which is the agency responsible for coordinating Australia's response to crisis, from natural hazards to terrorism-related incidents both here and overseas. I know that you've briefed Prime Ministers and Cabinet on all matters relating to disaster management. But across more than 40 years of service, Mark, you've worked with disasters and leaders from around the world, and those experiences, I believe, have given you a deep professional and personal insight into what it truly means to lead, from the end of the hose right through to the highest level of government. And I believe the greatest measure of success for you is always the same: upholding the public trust and confidence, and to lead with compassion. You've written a powerful book called Compassion in a Disaster Management, and what has always stood out to me is that you were the first person I'd actually heard talk about it with such conviction and compassion, care, and the human side of the work that we do, not as a slogan, but as a lived truth and shaped by decades of experience. You walk a path that many leaders avoid, and that courage is one of the reasons I admire the work that you do. You've also been a practicing Buddhist for more than 20 years and studied Buddhist philosophy intensely for 6 years under the guidance of an eminent Buddhist nun. That study has sharpened your awareness of how vulnerability, or the lack of it, shows up in leadership and culture. You've spoken openly about the harm caused when leaders become disconnected from the suffering of their people, especially in roles where we're called to serve and protect our communities. Your reflection resonates strongly with my own journey, because after the 2003 fires that I faced in the ACT, when I got to the end of the operational side of it, I knew that I needed to slow my leadership down. I needed to understand myself more, my reactions, and the emotional weight of the work that we do. You also graciously launched my book, Ashes of the Firefighters, in 2013, and you gave a heartfelt speech that I'll never forget. Mark, thank you for joining me on the Human Side of Emergency Management podcast. Your wisdom, your courage, and your commitment to the compassion are exactly why this podcast exists.
Thanks, Vivian. That's very humbling, I have to say.
But very true. And it is a privilege for me to be able to interview you in this space.
Thank you.
I just wanted to start with a question about your journey. So you've moved from high-profile emergency management roles into deep research, philosophy, and Buddhist practice. How have those studies and the influence of that shaped you as a human and also as a leader?
It's a really interesting question. I should, just before we start, I should let your listeners know I've got 3 dogs sitting at my feet. I'm hoping those 3 dogs will be quiet for the next half an hour or so, but we can't guarantee. So we'll see how we go. Look, I think it's a really good question. I'd probably start by saying that I think the intersections of Buddhism, philosophy, and career falls out of lived experience. I think I sort of worked out as time went on that I understood disasters operationally, scientifically, and then I started to understand them metaphysically and philosophically. I just kept deepening my understanding of the human experience and what was all this about, essentially. Why do we do what we do? Why do we have to experience what we have to experience? So disasters were a way of helping me to understand the world as I navigated my career very publicly, but also very privately. So at the same time, and I give many lectures on this, there's the public persona that we have in leadership, rank, position, authority, function, role, which are really important. And then there's what happens in the private life. And we tend to show one and not the other. And you can't separate the two. As a human, you can't separate the two. So I think modern Western economic society expects you to separate the two and just be a certain way publicly, because it reassures confidence and you kind of fulfill that role. But it can be really shallow. I notice with leaders who don't give something of the heart of themselves, of their spiritual and ethical truth, are just really shallow, hard to connect and hard to buy
Yeah.
into. So I went through really tough times in my 30s, and I've talked about this in a TED talk 12 months ago. Divorce, loss of family assets, curable cancer diagnosis, and other things. And it all came on top of me in my mid-30s, and it was pretty much unbearable, this sort of level of suffering. I remember having an epiphany one night about 3 o'clock in the morning because I couldn't sleep and I was very restless. But, what if this was for us, not to us? What if life was for you, not to you? From there, I kind of developed a bit of an insight as to adversity was a teacher and suffering how to function. And these things are meant to be teaching about virtue, that the greatest journey that a human being can take is to profoundly understand love and its absence. So what does it mean to love? What does it mean not to love? And that proposition came out some years later, about 2 years ago after my dear wife Carolyn passed away. I've had a life of lived experience of navigating human suffering on the incident ground as a firefighter, a deputy captain, a captain, a group captain, inspector, a superintendent, an assistant commissioner, a commissioner, director general, right the way through the system from the end of the fire hose to the office of the Prime Minister has been a journey of understanding suffering. But at the same time, navigating incurable cancer, loss of my wife, loss of family assets, mental health issues, and all those other things that we all go through was equally as important. So I've been very public about the intersections of these things as what shapes leadership. They say religion finds you, you don't find religion. I'm not a particularly religious person. I'm certainly spiritual. The continuation of consciousness beyond physical death is very important to me. And my current research and the book I'm writing is very much about that. It's an extension of the work I've been doing over the last 20 years. But we can't separate this notion of adversity and suffering as a teacher, as insight, as almost necessary to the human condition. And it doesn't justify harm. So I'm not justifying harm. I'm not saying there's not injustice in the world, because there is enormous amounts of injustice. But there's also something to learn from this. And I think when I reframed it in my 30s, I had to reframe again in my late 50s when Carolyn, it was really important that I took a philosophical view. And I say to leaders a lot, look, you need to develop a life philosophy, of lived experience and intersecting with the wisdom of the sages. So what are the great bodies of knowledge and great thinkers and great people who've walked the path before us? What have they said about life? And what does our own experience say about life? And you put those two things together and you come up with a worldview. And that worldview changes over time, and it should change as you have more experience. But I think leaders without that sense of worldview and without that ability to infuse their lived experience into their leadership philosophy become quite distant. I have a saying that arrogance is the brother of ignorance and wisdom is the sister of humility.
Yes.
And it's very masculine and feminine, not male and female, but masculine and feminine. And I learned in my 30s that, I came across these people who had a lot of knowledge, but they were arrogant. And because they're arrogant, they had an ignorance about them, not about the facts of their subject matter, but about the lived experience of life, that you couldn't access them.
Yeah, it's almost that detachment from their experiences in their life.
Hugely. You couldn't relate to them. Yet
Yep.
people who had this sense of humility had a wisdom about them. And there were two great mentors in my life. I've had many. And I would say to anyone in leadership, look, for goodness sake, find your mentors. Usually people who are older than you. Age can come with wisdom. It can come with arrogance as well, of course. One of my mentors was a Special Forces Padre in the Australian Army. He'd been to Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere with Special Forces, and he had, a really deep respect for life and his faith. He was a Uniting Church minister and a Buddhist nun. So I had a theistic mentor and a non-theistic mentor. And people would say, how does that work? And I would say, beautifully. Because it's a contest of ideas.
I was going to say it'd be a real challenge.
Usually.
But a positive challenge.
A positive challenge. And what I found was that both these people had embodied their belief system. So they weren't preaching, they weren't evangelizing, they weren't imposing. They had embodied. And that embodiment of their worldview brought with it an enormous amount of humility, but also an enormous amount of wisdom. And they would meet you wherever you were at. So whatever circumstance you found yourself in life, which had a moral connotation or a spiritual or ethical connotation, They just meet you there. They
Yeah.
wouldn't impose their view. They just meet you there. And you can unpackage that problem or that perspective and get some deeper meaning from it. So it's probably a long-winded way of answering your question. I may not have answered it at all, which is
No,
what
I think you did.
um,
Yes.
but I think, I say to my kids, you don't come here for a picnic, you go back for a picnic. We come here to learn. We incarnate to learn. We pass through this life into another realm. It's a whole other story. While we're here, it is about having a thoroughly human experience.
Yes.
And it is to profoundly understand love and its absence. What does it mean
Yeah.
to
No.
love? What does it mean when love isn't present?
Yeah. I quite often say when I'm coaching people that we have two ears and one mouth, and we
Yeah,
should use these more often to learn and to gauge and to accept and to forgive, to love, compassion, the whole kit and caboodle.
yeah.
Embracing all of that.
And our business is, you mentioned it in the opening, it is about securing public trust and confidence, or trust and confidence, because the world is harmful and we hold leadership positions because we're trying to protect people from harm.
Yes.
And I think if we hold that as the greatest measure of success, and we hold in our hearts the greatest mission is the reduction of human and non-human suffering. In other words, to be compassionate. You put those two things together, there's like a North Star. How we execute those two ethics is really complex and incredibly imperfect and sometimes near impossible. But it's not the point. They're not destinations per se, they're directions.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I've been in like really small adversarial positions, and when I step back and reflect on what my role was, sometimes it's been some of my biggest learnings, and it's led me on a path of change and recognition of where the role I played and the role that I can play in the future.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that open-mindedness and that sense of honesty and humility, which are really important attributes, open up pathways of possibility of interpreting meaning and circumstances in a more positive way.
Yep.
Buddhism is really, I've read philosophy for years, for over 20 years, and for a while I read theology as well. I found with Buddhist thought that it just absolutely nailed the concept of suffering in a really tangible and accessible way for people to understand. Out of all of the theologies and philosophies that talk about it, and there's certainly many that do, that suffering is a part of life,
Yes. Yep.
and we resist it. Schopenhauer said something similar, although he drew it from Buddhism. Nietzsche said similar things as well. That suffering is in fact a part of life, and it doesn't mean that it's okay, but it does mean that it's present. And I think the human mind, the human construct, is to avoid it at all costs and to chase happiness at all costs. And it's the avoidance of suffering that reduces our ability or negates our ability to be more compassionate to ourselves
Yes.
and to others. So suffering is a fact. When we deny that and run away from it, we're denying ourselves the opportunity to do something about it. And that's a
Yeah.
principle or a tenet that runs right through leadership and legislation and policy making and framework writing and everything else. That lack of consideration or holding space with one of the realities of existence.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I reflected back after going through the 2003 fires in Canberra with the leadership roles that I held, I wasn't broken, but I was in a space that I didn't understand. I felt vulnerable and traumatized, but I wasn't broken. And I don't know if that sort of makes sense, but I felt like I'd stepped into a space that I'd never been in before. So I had no lived experience. I had no biases. I had nothing to guide me because it was so new and so raw. And with so many people wanting you to fulfill that role as a leader and be there for them at the same time that you're suffering. And with the fires becoming more extreme and catastrophic now, I wonder whether we'll ever reach a point where we can openly talk about our experiences and how it actually affects us, because I certainly did. It took me on a long journey. As I said, I mentioned before that I had to slow my leadership down because I was used to being on the fire ground going bang, 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 you here, you there, you do this, we're done, blah, 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 blah. And then when I sort of stepped away from it and I went, oh my God, what are the learnings? What can I do better? I mean, we do the debriefs, operational debriefs, but I changed the system back then and I did an emotional debrief before we did the operational debrief because I felt there was so much swirling around and it was so easy just to jump into that judgment or lack of understanding. And it really drove me to be a better person. And I'm still learning, it's
Yeah.
still, it's an ongoing path for me. But I guess that courage and that trauma and the unknown was something that all put together in my little box, and where I became exceptionally vulnerable. But I tried to harness that vulnerability.
Joseph Campbell wrote a book in 1947, I think, called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he discovered what was called a monomyth. So he looked across religions and mythologies and the course of human history in its archetypal sense, and discovered that there was a monomyth. And this monomyth was this call to adventure, where we call from ignorance to fulfillment, essentially. And he articulates it in quite complex ways in his writings. And he wrote between 1940, mid-1940s to the late 1980s when he passed away. But this notion of being called to adventure and standing at the threshold of existence and stepping beyond the doorway into that adventure with an enormous amount of ignorance and innocence. He talked about the innocent fool, and he uses the mythology of Parsifal, the innocent fool, and the Grail King myth. So it's kind of like Monty Python, but not really, for those who say Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But the Holy Grail is not a thing. The Holy Grail is to discover our compassionate nature.
Yes.
But the journey of life is to really, and I'm really summarizing his work in, a few words, essentially, is to shift consciousness from one of self to one of other, but to move consciousness from self-interest and self-importance to the consideration of other people. The Buddha said the same thing. He said, we unfortunately, as humans, we get caught up in excessive amounts of self-importance and self-interest to the neglect of the needs of other people. And it's not a moral judgment, but it's the pathway of life. And when
Yes, I can
give up
relate to
this,
that.
we give up this, adamant sense of who we should be and sense of self in this perfect world that we're trying to create in order to perform, rather than the sense of self that is imperfect and does suffer and makes mistakes and needs to be compassionate to self and needs to be compassionate towards others. And he was just one of many writers who've given us insight. So when I look at your story, and I've known you a long time, and I've been in the sector over 40 years, I see the archetypal journey playing out for everybody. And I just wish, Vivian, that I knew this in my 30s before I became here.
I have the same thoughts. I wish I knew this when I was in my mid-20s, when I was,
Exactly.
really taking off in this field.
I just wish we had philosophers or whatever, people who could esoterically interpret this journey, or metaphorically interpret it, or allegorically interpret it in a way that makes sense to everybody who's in the system. That you will be confronted with realities that you've never experienced before. It will take you
Yes,
to places that you've never understood or known about. You will feel in ways that you've never felt before. It'll create realities that are temporary, particularly in severe to catastrophic disasters. They just create a set of circumstances where we really do our best work, and it fractures our identity. In fact, it shatters our identity. And we thought we knew who we were before we entered the realm. And then we go through these catastrophic disasters and we realise we have no idea who we are at all.
yeah, because
And
it
that
pushes
manifests as,
you way beyond you ever thought you could go. And then you got to sort of like take a step back and start analysing that. Oh my God, I can't believe I actually did that, or I was capable of doing that. And that understanding then makes you want to push yourself even further.
we label it PTSD, and we should, because it's traumatic. I'm not discounting the experience for a second, but I can interpret it in a way that says that there's also a pathway to healing, and it starts with understanding that we've crossed the threshold into the realm and taken an adventure, and it's shattered the illusion of ego. It's shattered the illusion of self, and now we have to put ourselves back together again in a more holistic way. That happened to me again when Carolyn died. She passed away suddenly without warning from a ruptured brain tumour, which was undiagnosed. So she
Gosh,
was here in the morning, and she was in a comatose state that night, and died 9 days later. I never got to say goodbye and all sorts of things. And so, I was shattered for the second time in my life. So the first time was in my 30s, where I went through what we now know as PTSD. And I was to turn up again in my late 50s with the death of Carolyn. And this complete shattering, it's complete obliteration of self. And the only thing I knew, I lost all sense of knowledge, history, memory, belief, whatever attributes you want to give, this sense of identity, was
yeah,
all completely gone. I didn't even have a home. I was sitting in my car the night she died. I didn't know which way to turn the steering wheel because I no longer had a home. I had a house. I didn't have a
yes,
home. There's one thing that I knew. That is, I love my wife. It was like a diamond. It was the only thing in my mind that I could say that I knew. I knew nothing else. And the last 3 years I've been putting myself back together again. And that'll happen beyond death. It'll keep going. but that's the second time I've been shattered in the course of my life. I can't help but think that the first time it happened in my 30s was a precursor to my late 50s, because the journey is very similar. That you hold a worldview, you think you know who you are, but guess what, Vivian? There's another layer.
Yeah.
There's another level of depth. There's another journey to take. There's more to discover. And suffering seems to be the pathway, but suffering's not separated from love. And if we understood that as leaders, as we entered the foray of emergency management, disaster grounds, terrorism grounds, war grounds, whatever, that we carried some of these insights with us, I just think it helps us at the other end. When we get through bloodied and damaged and scarred and
Yes.
beaten up and exhausted, we go, that was a journey, but I'm still here. Now, I'm either still here physically or I'm okay spiritually. Some people don't survive, of course.
It's sort of, you get to that path and you're either going to go this way or you're going to go that way.
Yeah, it's why, we're covering a lot of ground here, but it's why I'm interested in the continuation of consciousness beyond physical death, because Carolyn manifests in ways that have moved me from belief to knowledge. And that's a subject of another podcast, of course. And it's existentially quite unnerving, but particularly if you don't have that belief system or you've never thought about it, the whole
Yep.
concept of continuing on beyond this life is just too big and complex for most people. But I'm trying to put language to it over time in the next 12 months to say, look, it's worth thinking about in the context of where you are now, because you'll take attributes with you. And what do you want to take with you, and what do you want to leave behind? What's important in this realm of existence and the experiences that we have, and how we affect other people through our leadership and our words and our thoughts and our actions matters, because that characterization of who you think you are as consciousness keeps going.
It's so critical with what you're saying, and thank you for sharing that, Mark. It's one of the it's a journey, and it's the realizations that I don't think we share enough of. And I know for me, when I've gone through, the one thing that keeps me going through, and I guess it's in the realm of compassion, for me, it's actually gratitude. And when even if I have a fight, I try and look at it from a positive perspective, or if something doesn't quite go right, well, okay, what can I learn from that? Or I'm really grateful that I had that experience, because now I know I can do it better next time or whatever. And it just sort of almost manifests itself in me now after all these years.
I really commend you for the podcast, because these insights which you're gathering from leaders, the honesty and the rawness, I think is part of the reality of what it means to be a true leader. And
Yes.
we're all working it out. I mean, 40 years later, I'm still working it out. Was I a good leader? I've got no idea. You'd have to ask the people who I led. I can't say I was a good leader. All I can say is I did the best I could in the
Well, you've
circumstances.
left an impression on me, so I'm very excited to have you here on this podcast.
It's an unfolding space for all of us, I think, and that sense of journey through life with a sense of confidence, with a sense of ethos, virtue, compassion, trust, humility, kindness, generosity, all those sort of things are really important. And the capacity and space to reflect upon the experience as to what are we learning, because
Yeah,
adversity is a teacher. Adversity
it
teaches
is.
virtue. It teaches us how to love and how to be compassionate, how to be kind, all those sort of things. Suffering
It's
has
interesting. Sorry, it's interesting. You're leading so well into my next question.
oh, good.
So, okay, so we've been discussing suffering in all its forms and vulnerability, but you also talk about vulnerability through a Western lens, a loss of self, a loss of engagement, injustice, illness, and you describe suffering as universal. I relate to that deeply because I'm speaking with people all around the world. As I mentioned before we started, so I'll be speaking to people from Portugal, Africa, South America, Canada, America, uh, you know, because there's a lot of it. What we experience here is got a lot of similarities with what people suffer throughout the world. But I struggle sometimes with how people cope when they go through it the first time, because when they face a major event, and we were talking about this before about I wish we had this wisdom when we were in our 20s and 30s. They don't understand what's happening to them. It can be incredibly confronting, and I know we've both been through this. After a couple of catastrophic events, though, I can now recognise when I'm suffering. But for some leaders, the challenge is, how do we ensure that our communities don't suffer any more than they need to? And is this where compassion becomes essential in what we do as leaders?
The short answer is yes. It's a great question. And I try to cover this in the book. How can you, there's a couple of dimensions to this, of course, and, can you relate to the suffering of everybody else? Is that not overwhelming? And so it goes on. I think my answer to that starts off reasonably simple. The more you understand your own suffering, the more you'll understand others. It's actually that simple. In Buddhist philosophy, the First Noble Truth says that we should understand suffering. And it's birth, sickness, aging, and dying. And all the connotations and experiences and complexities around those four things, we all go through those. But there's four other things: losing people we love and things we like, having unpleasant experiences, not having our wishes fulfilled, and the suffering of what's called the aggregates of body and mind, which is essentially excessive self-interest and self-importance to the neglect of the needs of others. That's a bit more complex than that, but that's the best way to summarise it. And we all have that experience, irrespective of culture, race, creed, religion, generational place in history. It doesn't matter. We all go through that. And that's a very broad, sweeping statement, of course. But the more we can engage in how we feel and what we go through and what's unpleasant, the more we can see it in other people. And I think that for leaders who won't engage in their own human suffering and won't bring compassion to their own set of circumstances and contexts, will struggle to show it to other people. It's not that they can't show it at all, they won't be able to show it enough. I say in my book, it's not so much suffering. I mean, suffering is a problem, of course, and it needs to be addressed. But it's the denial, disavowal, or ignorance of suffering and vulnerability which causes it to otherwise flourish. Where we could otherwise do something about it, because we're denying it, ignoring it, or disavowing it, it flourishes unabated. And so we need to stop and check and re-engage with the subject. I got told the other day of a senior bureaucrat in one of the Australian governments didn't like the word vulnerability because it implied weakness, so the staff weren't to use it anymore.
It's such an old concept.
So staff weren't to use it anymore, and they were to talk about preparedness and exposure and that sort of thing. And I thought, you've just lost the heart of risk, because vulnerability is the susceptibility to suffer and the inability to cope.
Yes.
So it's a future state. It's a susceptibility towards suffering, which means it hasn't happened yet. Something can be done about it. Maybe not everything, but something can be done about it. And when you close that off and you don't even look at it, you don't even consider it, you don't contemplate it, you just look at exposure, or you just look at hazard, threat, or peril, then you're ignoring the human element.
And it's almost like they just want to build a brick wall around it and just leave it there.
Or categorise people as being vulnerable and not much we can do about it. We just have to feel sorry for them and do as much as we can, blah, 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 blah. Whereas most of the time people are generally vulnerable because of a set of structural, economic and social circumstances. Not exclusively, but we talk a lot about people should be exercising their agency to their fullest extent, but that's okay. But in order to exercise agency to your fullest extent, you need some sort of structural, economic and social factors in support of your desire to exercise your agency. When those things are missing, it's a bit arrogant to say you need to toughen up, you need to be more resilient, you need to be prepared, you need to be more whatever. When people are trying to be that way, but with the circumstances in which they find themselves, they can't get there. And I've seen time and time and time again, leaders inside the system hide behind the system and the policies and the frameworks, and so it goes on, and try and impose a view on people. It just doesn't work. Because
it's amazing just how it ripples through everything in life as well.
Well, leaders have access to the equities of power, wealth and resource. We have that in abundance compared to a citizen, compared to somebody who's at the end of the chain. Yeah, in my career, I had access to ministers. I had access to the Prime Minister, 3 of them over the course of my career. And I was able to provide advice, and they sought advice. It's an incredibly powerful position to be in. But you can cascade down through the system, and there's still that capacity to influence or capacity to execute the duties under the equities of power, wealth and resource. Again, I didn't discover this until my early 50s. And I thought, geez, I wish I knew this in my 20s, my 30s. Because with equities of power, wealth and resource comes discretion. And we can use discretion with those equities and really make a difference to people at a very micro level. The more you come up through the system, the harder it gets, because you're trying to cover off millions of people. But I remember in my PhD research about 10 years ago, I interviewed I won't tell you who it was, but a US governor of a state of 24 million people. which is subject of hurricanes and flooding and all that sort of stuff. And I said, how do you represent so many people? And he said, I'll tell you a story, and it's in my book. And he just become governor, and he got called to a meeting of parents who had children with severe disability. And they weren't happy with the policy settings of the state because the kids had become wards of the state when the parents passed away. Like the state would take over care of the children. They weren't happy with the policy settings, so they asked the governor to go along and address the issue, and they were pretty hostile. And one parent was particularly vocal and said to him, look, we're not happy, blah, 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 blah. And he said, look, I don't understand what it's like to have a child with disability. It's not in my frame of reference, but I'm willing to learn. So he said, how about we do this? How about I come and live with you for 5 days? You can show me what it's like, and so I can have the experience. So she agreed, and he did. He took 5 days out of his time and went and lived with the family. He's so profoundly moved by what he experienced. He came back and he changed many of the policy settings to be more favourable to the parents' desires and wishes. He couldn't do all of it, but he did a lot of it. And
Amazing courage.
this woman went from being an adversary to one of his best friends over time. And he said, Mark, that it's really important to understand this, that the story of one represents the story of many. Symbolism is really important. And the sentiment of that story is even more important. How people are feeling is more important than what they're thinking. You can then go to the data and check it. So we can all go to the numbers, the facts, the figures and check to make sure it's fine or whatever. But start with the symbolism and the sentiment. And many a politician I interviewed for my research said very similar things. Yet I don't hear that inside bureaucracy. I don't hear that inside agency. I don't hear that sense of sentiment and symbolism. I hear duty, obligation, rules, policies, frameworks, SOPs. I hear all of that, and they're fine. But they're also places to hide. They're places to hide behind. Now I know we live in a fairly litigious society, and we're trading on outrage and fear at the moment at a global scale. So it needs a lot of courage to think differently. But compassion calls for courage. Compassion means you're going to hold space with the suffering of another human or non-human, and you're going to do as much as you can to alleviate it.
Yeah.
So, compassion, courage, and wisdom are 3 things that go very neatly together, which make for effective leadership in my mind.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even just the small things. I'm a body language person. I quite often read people's body language. And I remember when I was giving briefings, especially in 2003, we had a big catastrophic fire, and a lot of people, this was their first fire. I'd only literally finished training them about 4 or 5 months before, probably 3 months before. And everyone was getting thrown in the deep end. And because of that body language, when I'd give a briefing, I'd always look for the people that were hanging back, the ones that just didn't seem to be quite engaged. As soon as I'd finished my briefing, I'd make a beeline for them to make sure that they heard everything, they understood everything, but more importantly, they could tell me if they had fears or they were worried or there was something there that was affecting their capacity, because it was a big moment for everyone. And just something that small and that attentive. And for me, that was showing compassion to that person, being in an environment they'd never been before, and it could go one way or the other. They could get a lot out of the experience, feel like they were heard and that they were supported, or they could be really scared and feel like, I don't want to be here. It's sort of, to me, those little small things have always been really important and make a big difference for people. But this also leads me on to my next question, a bit more about compassion. So you talk about, it's a comment in your book actually that struck me. So on page 159, for those people that are interested to know where I got it from, you talk about compassion as a virtue and why it's often constrained. You write that while we may have an ethical obligation to show compassion, leaders are often overwhelmed to the sheer amount of suffering we're exposed to. I call that my emotional bucket. And when it starts to overflow, I know I start to go into self-preservation mode. And I was sort of going to get you to expand on that a little bit, because I recognise it. I know I've got to start implementing a lot of things for myself, whether it's getting my network, my tribe around me, taking a day off, depending on the circumstances, what it is. But it also struck me that in your book, you had a quote there, again, which resonated with me, from Mother Teresa, where if I look at the mass, I will never act. but if I look at the one, I will. It really captured something for me so true about our human nature.
Absolutely. And particularly those drawn to emergency management will have this natural disposition or propensity to want to save the world.
Yes. Yeah, we do.
We do. We want to save the world. There's a number of layers to that. One is it's a wonderful intention. It's towards altruism. We're not purely altruistic. We're human. We're fallible in so many ways. But we've got this sense of altruism, which is part of our North Star, if you like, and moves us forward. I say to leaders a lot, look, except in the most rarest circumstance, all compassion is asking you to do is be reasonable about it, the extent to which you are able. And that's it. And sometimes the circumstances will require you to be very unreasonable, put your life on the line, give your life for somebody else. That's the unreasonable state. And some of us who are no longer here to talk about it, at least physically, have done that. We've seen that evidenced in our organisations, and so goes on. And it's incredibly moving, and it's incredibly heroic, and it's incredibly powerful to see people do that. But that's not where we all need to be operating at. So it's the extent to which you are able. And if you're mindful of your capacity to be compassionate to the extent to which you are able, then I would argue that's enough. Take a big metaphysical, esoteric view of it. People have their lived experience and their karma to navigate. And our job is to contribute to their story, contribute to their experience in a positive and meaningful way. Sometimes we can't save the world, Vivian, and I don't think we're meant to. I don't think we're meant to. I think we're just, our job is to participate and make a contribution. Some days that's one person, and other days it's 10 people. And some days it's yourself, because that's all you got capacity for. And all of that is fine. All of that is fine. So this obligation or burden to save the world, whatever the world looks like in your frame of reference, can be an abrogation of self-compassion. I'm not going to look after myself. Instead, I'm going to be the hero and look after everybody else. That's foolish compassion. So it's got to start with self. Compassion has to start here, and then it radiates out. And it goes back to my initial comments that we don't hold space for suffering long enough to understand our own, let alone anybody else's. So if we want to become more compassionate people, and let's face it, who doesn't? And we are compassionate people. I mean, the vast majority of people are good people on the pathway of developing their compassion. But that has to be reflective of self-care and self-compassion as well. And that's what I talk about in the book, that, you can step on this pathway of the journey of life and not look after yourself, and you won't get very far. You fall flat in your face.
Yes.
So looking after ourselves is really important. So in the book, that's where I talk about the symbolism and sentiment and data and ways of looking at the numbers without becoming insensitive. But I think at the end of the day, my experience would tell me, and I think philosophy has spoken a lot about it. Look, and the Dalai Lama talks about this a lot as well. Make sure you look after yourself.
Absolutely. Yep. We all learn that the hard way, don't we?
We do, because altruism is a wonderful thing. But, I say a lot about emergency services that sometimes bright lights have dark shadows, and we can march down the road of being compassionate and kind and caring and forget about the rest of it. And when we forget about the rest of it, we get ourselves into strife. Culturally, socially, personally, we don't tend to the wounds because we're too busy looking after the wounds of others.
Yes.
We get tripped up. We kind of trip over. So compassion's complex. It's one of the most complex ethics or virtues that you could possibly think about, but it's also essential.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I know you write about in the book that as leaders, we must be prepared to see, to sense, and to feel the suffering of others.
Yeah.
And we need that really to connect with people through their distress, their uncomfortable feelings. We need to remain open and act practically, really, to alleviate a lot of that suffering. And you do say that we have to grant ourselves that same obligation, which I've learned, as I've said, the hard way to do that. But it also resonated with me because in the second major fire, as I mentioned, I attended, I was able to do that because I had the wisdom and the learning from the first fire. But for people who've never experienced it, that's, I think, where the challenge lies, as I've mentioned before. How do we help the leaders recognise this and to care for their own suffering so that they can then care for others? And I don't know if there's one truth about leadership or something I could leave for the next generation of emergency managers. I'm not really sure what it would be, but to be open and to be compassionate and to be authentic and not run away from those feelings and what you're learning on the human side of dealing with people and communities.
Be kind to yourself and have a lightheartedness about it. You see, this is the problem of Western thinking and materialistic thinking, particularly in secular thinking. We're increasingly believing that this is it, that there is nothing else. We're trying to cram everything into a materialistic existence. But there's so much evidence to suggest that that's a load of rubbish, that there is so
Yes.
much more to think about. And we don't have to cram everything into this one single life. We do have to contemplate where we came from and where we're going to. And they're really complex. And I'm not for a minute suggesting they're simple, but we've got to give ourselves a break. I mean, in Buddhist philosophy, they talk about the three marks of existence, which is egolessness, suffering, and impermanence. Everything, Vivian, is impermanent. Nothing is permanent.
Yes.
Everything depends on causes and conditions. There's no dependent origination. Sorry, there's no independent origination. Everything is dependent on causes and conditions. Everything, you and I, and everything we experience, and everything we touch is in a state of flux, is in a state of change. So when I talk about helping people who are distressed or suffering, that experience of suffering that they're going through is in itself impermanent. Our role is to contribute towards its alleviation. But it will end at some point anyway. It will end of its own accord. Our job is to contribute towards it. We can take ourselves a little less seriously, a little bit more lightheartedly, a little bit more curious, kinder, more compassionate, whilst participating in the world, and the world would be a better place, and we would be much happier for it. So this sense of seriousness, this sense of strong identity, this sense of permanent self, sense of the ego aspect of mind is just unhelpful.
Yeah.
It's a cause of suffering. So we're so much more. I say to people in my lectures that the body you were born with is not the body you have now. If you live a full life, it's not the body you'll die with. And the same is true of your mind. The mind you're born with is not the mind you have now. It won't be the mind you die with. We're in a state of flux. We're streams of consciousness moving through. If you take that as a premise and think about you're a river, not a rock. You're in a process of unfolding, not a permanent, stagnant state
Yeah.
of being. It opens up a whole range of possibilities about who we might become. And they're all existential, really big existential things to talk about, but they're like a relief valve. Because Vivian, you are changing every moment of the day.
Yeah.
This podcast is changing you. It's changing me. I mean, all the research I'm doing now about consciousness is changing who I am. And I'm an unfolding process, as are you, as is everybody else. I think there's a lot of joy in that, in the participation of that journey, with a sense of virtue and ethics and morals, which are grounded in worldviews and lived experience, but we should talk about more and explore more and sit comfortably with. And I think that just makes the journey more pleasurable, more rewarding.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always have a saying, I've got to keep my toes in the soil because I have to be connected to nature, the land, the bush, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I know when I live in a city, I've got to go bush at least 2 or 3 times a year. But I'm fortunate that I live on a farm and we work a farm and I see that raw reality every day.
Yeah.
And so it keeps me very much grounded. And I know at times people says, oh, you do this, Vivian, and blah, blah, blah. And how do you keep that reality? And I said, well, as soon as I go over the grid on the farm at home, I know I'm back to basics.
Absolutely.
And it's going to dictate my experiences, while I'm there. And I really value that as well. But I guess there's one question that I do ask everyone getting towards the end of the podcast. And I guess in some ways it's my closing question because you've been so generous and honest in your conversations, and I really value that. And as I said, this is part of the reason why I started this podcast, because it's stuff that we don't talk about often enough, but it's so inherently within us. And I always say this is the heart of what we do, and that's pretty much my tagline. When everything else falls away, the roles, the expectation, the pressure, what remains at the core of your leadership? What is the one thing that keeps you going?
So the only thing I want to put as an epitaph on my gravestone, although I'll probably be cremated, is that he cared, because I care a lot.
Yep.
And I think that summarises my life. It's why I do what I do. It's why I continue to research and lecture and teach. I didn't say in the podcast, but I've recently been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. So I've got a journey ahead of me, which is complex. But whilst ever I can continue to mobilise and communicate. I'll participate, to quote Joseph Campbell, joyfully in the sorrows of the world, providing a meaningful contribution in this great journey called life.
And keeping that joy.
Keeping the joy there and the happiness that comes with it, but also that sense of meaning and purpose that we're participating in something much, much bigger, cosmically much, much bigger than we're prepared to admit or give ourselves credit. And that's what inspires me to keep doing the work that I do, and inspires the next book, which I'll hopefully have out in about 6 to 9 months' time, which goes into the book's called The Stories We Learn to Hide. And it's the metaphysical and psychic and existential experiences we have that we don't talk about, which are profoundly meaningful for people. And I'm talking to people in very senior positions, highly qualified, intelligent, articulate, religiously and culturally diverse people who have these wonderful stories about wisdom and truth, which they never get to talk about because society says, well, that can't be true. That can't be possible. You can't prove that. And I think that's really sad. I think
it's really difficult too when you get on that spiritual side as well.
Look, it's complex because people can become evangelistic or adamant or pedantic, or there's all sorts of words to describe those positionalities, and we have to be cautious about that. But the people I'm speaking to have this enormous sense of humility and open-mindedness and ambiguity about their experiences, but there's something much deeper sitting there called love, called compassion, called kindness, called relationality, which is what they're communicating through their experiences. And I think, I'll finish on this. We're all in the big boat together, trying to get to the yonder shore. And what is the yonder shore? Happiness, love, peace, contentment. We're all in the big boat trying to get there.
It's funny you should say that because, as I mentioned before, I have a core purpose statement which I live by, and that's to live a life full of love, courage, learning with beauty and strength. And to me, that's my principle in life, and that's what I try to live by, and that's what gives me strength, courage, compassion. Because if I talk about the courage, it's what keeps me grounded and makes the good stuff happen.
Absolutely.
And, if I talk about strength, it's what gives us integrity and ensures that we support each other in the work that we do.
Yeah.
So when I got asked to put together a core purpose statement, you know what? It just came out of me just like that.
Good.
And whereas other people, it took 2-3 days, 2 weeks, but I just knew. It just came out.
We all need a North Star. We all need a philosophy of life, an insight to our ethics and our morals and our sense of being and character that guides us through, which is in itself spiritually dimensioned, without giving it further definition, without aligning it to theologies or dogmas or belief systems or whatever. We're spiritual beings. We're fundamentally, that's who we are. So that defining your North Star, using it as a guide, and being open-minded to it changing over time as you live and experience more things is really important in leadership. And, I think that's what we've been talking about the last 40-odd minutes.
No, exactly. And thank you for that. Is there anything you think that I haven't covered that we should discuss, or pretty much?
I think we covered a lot of ground. I think we will leave our listeners with a lot to think about and hopefully a lot to relate to. I'm hoping that they can relate to a lot of what we've talked about, and so they don't feel quite so lonely or they don't feel quite so isolated. And I think that's the power of podcasts like this, that it's the relationality. My whole book is about relationality, but the shared lived experience of human suffering, but also the shared human experience of being compassionate and loving and truthful and honest and all those sort of things is a delightful story. And I just hope people get something out of it. And thank you for the opportunity to have a chat.
No, I'm so pleased that you're able to come on and be a guest on the human side of emergency management. To me, it's so critical that we do much more exploration in this space. And that's part of the reason why I started this podcast. I'd love to get you back again, especially when you're nearing the end of the book or your book's published. I think there's a lot there that a lot that we can still cover. And I do have to ask this final question, Mark, because I know everyone out there listening or watching will want to know, how are the dogs going?
They're fine. I have 2 13-year-old Border Collie Kelpies and a 5-year-old Border Collie. So I have not one spare minute to myself. I have 3 of the most intelligent dogs walking the planet, and I'm their entertainment director. 18 hours a day, they look to me for something to do.
Yep. We've just lost one of our premier working dogs on the farm, and it's just left a big hole in our household. But we've got a couple more, and every time one dog passes, there's another one that comes in, and they're all Kelpies. They're red Kelpies, and they're the most gorgeous dogs.
The 3 dogs are what got me out of bed every morning after Carolyn passed away. And one
Yes.
particularly, my little border collie Oscar, who was only 2 at the time, would wake me up, drag me to his lead, and tell me we have to go for a walk. And he did that every day for 12 months. He just knew that if he didn't get me out of bed, I probably wouldn't have got out of bed. So
Yeah, and animals are such a great comfort.
have compassion in their own right,
They do.
without a doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a wonderful note to finish on, Mark. I can't thank you enough for being a part of this, for sharing your story, for sharing your journey, being honest and raw and open. Thank you.
You're welcome.